Um, yeah, so what I want to zoom in on today is, pick up on this idea of sustainable transitions that are actually needed in order to really, in an effective way, tackle climate change. What we need to do with while center staging climate justice. So I will be talking about how climate justice as a concept, as a perspective, that really highlights structural inequalities, especially the role of marginalized communities, and put them at the center stage in order to understand specifically problems, but also solutions when it comes to the climate crisis. And I want to start with the global impact that is uneven. I think we've heard it already earlier today, that we know that climate change is not just caused by humanity, and it's not just impacting humanity in general, right? So the impact of climate crisis is uneven on a global scale. We know that in the global south, the impact is much harder, much more direct as we speak. Think, for example, about small islands that are currently living in these climate emergencies. And we know also what the root cause of this uneven distribution is of climate risks, namely the role of especially rich countries historically and their industrial capitalist models of economic growth. So in order to really understand this from a climate justice perspective, we need to highlight this uneven structure and center stage that, quote unquote, remote suffering that is not just out there in the global south, it's directly entangled with the way in which we, the global north, organize our economic systems. This also means that we have the potential here, the opportunity to link it to discourses and initiatives around anti-racism. And this is relevant because we know that especially low-income countries and groups and people of color on a global scale are impacted the most, while having contributed to climate change the least. So there is, climate justice highlights the idea that it's not enough to only think about climate change and climate solutions, but also link it to racial justice and draw these connections more clearly instead of only seeing them as climate issues. And when we think about solutions, very often we tend to think about them, and by we, I mean many governments and business leaders tend to think of sustainable technologies as solutions. So think about renewable energy technologies, and the example of the electric vehicle is of course very pertinent, in that it tries to move away from a fossil regime into a more electric kind of energy or mobility regime that is much more clean and green. But we also know at the same time that these technologies can also be problematic, even though they might be presented as necessary technologies for the transition. So think, for example, about electric vehicles as just a case in point. In order to produce the batteries of many of these electric vehicles, we need finite resources. We need cobalt, we need lithium, we need minerals and metals that are mined in countries with either a colonial history or in more poor regions that are conflict prone. Think, for example, about the cobalt crisis in the Republic of Congo. In almost slave-like conditions, kids are mining these minerals that are in fact also providing the input of the batteries, the electric vehicles, and thus the technologies that fuel our sustainable energy regime. So we need to think critically about what we present as solutions, and especially this dark side of the electric alternatives. So what climate justice really does in this particular context is it addresses new forms of extractionism, new forms of problematic economic models that might reproduce injustices, and forms of violence that are rendered invisible, that are rendered inaudible. And it calls for strict regulations, for example, about the role of institutions, in the European Commission, for example, that might have imposed much stricter regulations when it comes to accepting electric vehicles with these problematic histories, with this problematic supply chain, while at the same time taking it a step further and also create alternative visions, radically green visions that are also socially just and do not depend on new forms of exploitation. When we think more locally about solutions that are presented by city officials or policymakers, there are all kinds of climate projects or subsidies that are presented. But based on my own research also, what I've found is that in many of these cases, what you see is a set of usual suspects that applies for these subsidies or that participates in these projects and initiatives. For example, about sustainable energy or food and networks in the Netherlands. There's a subsidy that has been imposed, for example, a few years back, that has been introduced to provide people with a small kind of budget or grant to create a kind of a climate initiative themselves. But these forms were very technical, very difficult to understand. It also assumes a specific network, specific know-how, specific skills, specific set of income and social capital that basically also excludes a lot of people. So when we think of solutions in the role of governments, what climate justice also does, it addresses how climate policies, climate initiatives, and climate strategies can also create and reproduce social exclusion, which means that we need to center stage also inclusive policies, inclusive thinking, when we design these kinds of solutions, especially providing resources and funding for local communities. There was, of course, also a lot of nice inspirations to draw on. One that I really like is this transition town activist garden Ron Finley in the US. What he does is he basically, I think it's in LA, where he basically says we need to dig into the ground and reconnect to nature, and especially in these unprivileged or deprived neighborhoods, so to say, with the so-called food deserts. We need to especially connect the youth to the ground and to fresh produce. They can grow it themselves. So we need to get gangster with your shovel and just plant some shit. So it's also an act of resistance, occupying these public spaces and turning them into communities of care while reconnecting to nature and addressing environmental issues and climate issues in a radically different way. This brings me to the closing. So what I wanted to this take home message is that I think we need to take seriously climate justice as a guiding perspective in addressing climate crisis. So climate issues are also political and ethical issues. That means that we need to connect climate and social issues and understand transition problems and solutions from that point of view. And it particularly highlights the role of marginalized communities in specific transition projects that can be local, can be regional or that can be transnational. At the same time, what we also need to do is hold institutional and privileged actors accountable for just sustainable change, because in many instances, they have resources that other communities and people do not have. So we can hold them accountable at the same time. And in terms of education, I think that's a really important point to take into account as well, is at every school, university level where there's a course on climate change or the environment, it's not a technical or a natural science issue. It is also a political issue, which means we need to center stage climate justice as well in the educational system. That's it. Thank you for your attention.